Hello, my name is Dr. Hannah Hobson and I'm recording this talk to be put onto the Sunray YouTube channel in celebration of Developmental Language Disorder Awareness Day, which this year in 2024 is on Friday the 18th of October. So I originally gave a version of this presentation in 2023 when we had the opportunity to put on a DLD and wellbeing event for professionals in York. Hello again if you are rewatching this a year on and want to be reminded of what we talked about, or if you missed that the first time round, then a really warm welcome and thank you for tuning in. So I'm going to take you through the definition of developmental language disorder and set out a little bit of the context of some of the work that our academics do at the University of York in relation to DLD. So if you haven't heard of developmental language disorder before, well, you're not alone. Many have not. So I'm going to give a broad definition now. DLD describes a child who has not developed language to the expected degree, and this problem in language development isn't able to be explained by a clear biological reason. So, for example, a genetic syndrome such as Down syndrome, or a traumatic brain injury. And it also isn't the case that the child hasn't had adequate opportunity to develop language, so in cases of sort of severe neglect, for example. So essentially we have problems with language development and no real explanation for why that has happened. You might have come across DLD in some previous names. So in 2016-17 there was a big push to all get behind one term, DLD. Prior to that, the same group of children were referred to by quite a number of different names. So when I was coming up doing my PhD, I was using the term specific language impairment. Some of you may have heard of that. Developmental aphasia, expressive language disorder are also all in the mix as well. But since 2017, we've really all tried to use the same language, which is developmental language disorder. So this is a visual that was developed by Raising Awareness of DLD, which is an awareness campaign with the explicit aim of trying to raise awareness about developmental language disorder. And what this visual summarises nicely is all the different ways in which DLD can show itself. So we have these sort of different areas of language that can be affected, from learning and memory, social language, discourse, sentences, words and speech sounds, and all the different, I suppose, specific symptoms in which you might see these coming out. So, for example, a child that has problems with discourse might, when they're trying to tell you an anecdote or a story or tell you about something that's happened, they might give you that story in quite a strange order that might make it actually quite difficult to follow, or might even make it seem like children are actually changing the story they're telling occasionally. Sorts of problems with words we often find might be things like having quite a small vocabulary relative to other children that child's age, trouble learning new words, trouble finding words as well, so experiencing that tip of the tongue phenomenon a great deal. Speech sounds are mentioned here. Not all children with DLD will have speech sounds. So some will struggle to sort of say certain sounds, but some children, their speech will sound pretty normal. And actually those children are at the greatest risk of being missed. Because actually a child with a speech sound problem is quite easy to hear. I think adults kind of tune into that more than they recognise when perhaps a child isn't understanding something or is making sort of subtle grammatical errors or has a weak vocabulary. That can be much harder to spot. So some people ask about what is happening with these child's non-language abilities. So if a child has got, poor vocabulary, some grammatical problems, narrative issues, what are we really expecting about the other strengths or difficulties that child might show? So historically, there was a lack of clarity about what we should expect for these children's non-verbal IQ. But recently, the criteria would argue that a child who is going to get a diagnosis of developmental language disorder won't have intellectual disability, so they will have an IQ above, say, 70. There's no need for there to be a big discrepancy between non-verbal IQ and a verbal IQ. So, a child that was showing sort of weak but not impaired non-verbal IQ wouldn't not get a diagnosis of developmental language disorder. So it used to be the case that we were expecting a big gap between verbal and non-verbal IQ. That's no longer the case. Part of that is because actually as children age, even on non-verbal IQ tests, we know that language reasoning can actually be a real tool to be able to do those tasks. It's very, very difficult to design a non-verbal IQ task that's totally bulletproof to language, because we know language is a really great tool and resource for problem solving. In terms of other non-language abilities or non-language topics, we know that developmental language disorder, while it's defined by an impairment in the language domain, that these children often show other problems in their education and emotional lives. And these are just some of the impacts of DLD that we focus on at the University of York Psychology Department. So we know there are links to literacy development, mental health, emotion recognition, issues related to sleep, and we also are increasingly interested in camouflaging in DLD and what impact they may have. So these topics will be covered by some additional flash talks, which will also be on the Sunray YouTube channel. So you can tune in to a 5-minute talk on each of these if you would like to. And yes, these are the individuals involved from our department who are researching these topics, and that's me down the bottom looking at camouflaging. These are some illustrations, some pieces of art done by a young woman with developmental language disorder. And I think I like these images a lot because I think they make several points. So one is that it's not the case that children with DLD have nothing to say, even if they have language problems. So you can see from these art pieces that Susie has created, she has a lot to say about her experience and she can articulate it very well, particularly when given sort of other routes to do so, such as art. The other thing that strikes me about Susie's work, she talks about, or she sort of describes in these art pieces, about the difficulties having developmental language disorder. And my impression reading these or looking at these is that a lot of her problems don't really just stem from the DLD itself, but rather how other people treat her as a consequence of her DLD, or from other people not knowing enough about DLD and how that impacts her. So that was sort of really one of the motivations for putting on the original wellbeing event, was to try and raise the profile of developmental language disorder locally, to try and mitigate some of these sort of secondary problems that come from people not knowing very much about DLD or how to help. So this is an activity you can do in a group or by yourself, however you'd like to do it. We're going to go through a couple of facts and myths about DLD, just to refine that definition a little bit further. So I've got a few slides like this where I've got some statements on the left, and then I'm going to reveal to you whether they are in fact facts or myths. So one of them, if you've been listening, I've already told you the answer. So children with DLD will have problems with their speech, that is, difficulties articulating speech sounds. Developmental language disorder affects 1 child in every 1,000, and developmental language disorder is more or less common in boys and girls. So if you want, you can pause the video, jot down your answers, and I'll now reveal the answers. So as mentioned previously, there are many children with DLD who don't have any speech problems at all, and those children are probably at most risk of not being recognised. Developmental language disorder affects a lot more than 1 children in every 1,000. It may surprise you to learn that it actually affects 7 to 8 children in every 100. So roughly around 2 children in every UK classroom, making it one of our most common neurodevelopmental conditions, even though few people have heard of it. The ratio of boys to girls with DLD is 1.3 to 1, so slightly more boys, but not very many. It's nearly equal. It does seem that boys are more likely to receive speech and language therapy. Now, this suggests to me that we're perhaps less good at spotting language problems in girls, perhaps because we expect to see them less. So here are our next set of facts or myths. So 1, hearing problems are ruled out when making a diagnosis of DLD. 2, children with developmental language disorder can have a range of social outcomes. Some children form good peer relationships, but others struggle. And developmental language disorder is more likely in bilingual children or children where more than one language is spoken at home. So again, you may pause if you wish, and I shall show us the answers now. So yes, hearing problems are usually ruled out when making a diagnosis of DLD. we would consider a history of hearing problems to be a kind of a reason for why language problems may have occurred. So hearing is definitely looked at during that process. And the second statement is also true. So children with DLD are very variable in terms of their social outcomes. And we actually know that good peer relationships are a really good protective factor against negative outcomes such as mental health problems. It seems that perhaps those early social experiences can set children up to do well, but children who perhaps struggle to make friends, it can kind of isolate children further. Bilingualism is not a risk factor for developmental language disorder. It does make diagnosis more complicated. This is because to get a diagnosis of developmental language disorder, the language problems should not be specific to one language. If you have DLD, it will affect all the languages that you speak, which does mean then if a speech and language therapist has a multilingual family, they've got to try and work out if the child is showing problems in the home language as well. So that does make diagnosis harder, but bilingualism is not a risk factor for DLD. And we know from families we've worked with that many bilingual families were told to stop speaking to their children in their native language. We do not recommend that anymore. It does not help. It doesn't make the DLD go away. And what it can do is actually cut children off from an important part of their culture and heritage. Okay, our final set of facts and myths. Children who already have a diagnosis of autism cannot have a diagnosis of developmental language disorder as well. Developmental language disorder should be diagnosed in young children, i.e. the early years, before age 5. And developmental language disorder should resolve by secondary school, providing speech and language therapy has been implemented. So, sorry, I didn't count you down, so hopefully you wrote down your answers. So yes, autism is usually ruled out when making diagnosis of DLD. So we know for autistic children and young people, language ability really varies. So some children with autism will have some language problems too. Others will have very good language. If there was already a diagnosis of autism present, that would be kind of considered again a reason why the language problems may have arisen. So that would rule out DLD. It's not very unusual, I'd say, for a child who has a diagnosis of DLD to later go on to get a diagnosis of autism. We see that a fair bit in our own lab. What's tricky there is that children with DLD can develop social problems that can look a lot like autism later in life. That is partly due to the secondary effects of having a language and communication problem, what that does to one's social abilities. So that is complicated, but it would normally rule it out. So generally speaking, clinicians are unlikely to give a diagnosis of DLD in a very young child. It does happen sometimes, but the reason they usually don't do that is because we know that in the early years, so before age 5, you will get late talkers, so toddlers who aren't meeting their language milestones, and a good chunk of those late talkers just catch up by school age, okay? So they don't have these persistent language problems. A diagnosis of DLD indicates that the clinician thinks that these are persistent language problems. This is not being delayed in language that you're going to catch up later. So because of that, many clinicians won't diagnose DLD in a very young child. They'll want to wait to see whether those language problems persist into later schooling. DLD is a lifelong neurotype, so it will not resolve by secondary school, even if speech and language therapy has been implemented. So speech and language therapy can be so helpful, particularly for children to develop good strategies and self-advocacy skills, but the language problems will never be removed by speech and language therapy. We can think of this as a bit like autism. There are no interventions that remove autism. A child is autistic, they're going to be an autistic adult. It's the same for DLD. So I'll include the link to this other video on the Rattled website, just so you can go and watch it. But the reason I really like this video, if you watch the signs of SLI, now called DLD, is it's got, I think, 3 different children in it talking about their experiences. And what I think it's helpful to reflect on is whether if you met that child, would you think, oh, this is a child with a language problem? I think actually if I met any of these 3 children, I wouldn't necessarily jump to that conclusion, and I work in DLD research. And the point is that children's language problems can be very hard to spot. They don't always make themselves very obvious. Children aren't always going to say, I'm sorry, I haven't understood that word, or that sentence was too long. And that can mean that teachers or professionals working with children need to be a little bit of a detective to perhaps realise that there is a child in front of them who might have developmental language disorder. So I'm going to stop there for my introduction video. I hope that's given you a bit of context about what DLD is. Please tune in to our other flash talks, which will cover some of the other things that pop up in association with DLD. And I'll be back for a short talk on camouflaging and masking it in DLD if you are interested. Thank you very much.